varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given the spirit of utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge, according to the same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit. To another gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another the working of miracles. To another prophecy. To another the discernment of spirits. To another various kinds of tongues. To another the interpretation of tongues. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually, just as the Spirit chooses.
Good morning. Do the kids have a class? Okay. Dawson's like, yeah, we do. I better not be staying in here. A few announcements. Remember, if you're on the finance committee or Thriving Congregations, we're meeting right after the service. Secondly, next week is our network member meeting for our justice ministry. If you are a network member, we are going to meet right after the service next week, January 26th, and we will provide lunch. So that's that. And it's going to be a good time of issue updates and then planning our invites for the Nehemiah Action, which is April 8th, so we can have a strong turnout. Our church, of course, has turned out more than our average weekly attendance for the past few years, and we're going to try to do that again this year. Although next year it's going to be harder because our weekly attendance is going to go up. Putting it out there, making moves. And then third, next week you will be hearing from Mary in this spot. Is it big enough to call it a pulpit? I don't know. Do we call it? Yeah, Matt said it's a pulpit. Okay. But Mary will be sharing with us next week. As we move into the season after Epiphany, I'm excited to look into our text today. I really enjoy both of these. They're a couple of favorites of mine. We're going to be pretty straightforward today, and I hope that it'll be something clearly encouraging for you, as we often need times of encouragement. I don't really have a lot of interaction. I have tons of interaction with the band, but I don't really help pick the songs unless there's a week where I'm like, can you sing this one? But I'm glad that Time for Flowers came up this week because, we all, that song's heavy because it talks about, I've seen times of war and famine, right? But Time for Flowers comes again. But in all of our lives, we have moments where the despair can creep in, right? Less encouraging times than other times. And there's something powerful in the mentality that says, if you just wait those times out, right? You'll find the time for flowers again. Maybe you're in one of those times today, maybe you're not, but I think we all need times of encouragement and challenge as we move through our world together, and I hope today's sermon can do that for you. I'm not expecting the words of this sermon to enlighten you. I'm not arrogant enough to think that's the case, but I do hope that they give you the space to take the next step in your faith journey. The story of the wedding of Cana is just so fun, isn't it? I did the slides today, and I hope most of you felt like I did a pretty good job of keeping up and getting the words out at the right time. But there was one slide you may have noticed that was kind of late, and that was because Michael was showing me on a calculator how many bottles of wine just one of those pitchers would have made, one of those clay jars would have made, right? Because I've read the text 3 or 4 or 5 times this week, right? But hearing it again as Keith is reading it, 6 or 7 jars, each 20 to 30 gallons. Oh man, that's a lot of wine, right? I don't know how many gallons. I know that's such a simple math problem, but I'm not going to do it. But Michael said that each one of those ceremonial jars would have been 125 bottles of wine. That's just a lot. I don't know how big this party was, But I have to imagine even the entire town of Cana and maybe Capernaum, and throw a couple of these other peasant towns in where the populations are like 1,000 people. Like, even if you had 3 or 4 towns, it's a lot. And so it's a fun story. And it's interesting that in the narrative of John's gospel, this is the first of Jesus' like public declarations of who he is. If you are familiar with the narrative of the Gospel of John, John builds his story around 7 signs or works of power or miracles, right? 7 miraculous shows of divine power. And this is one of them. This is the first one. One of the signs that John concludes his book by saying, Jesus did many other things, but this is what I think you really need to know, to believe, to put your allegiance towards, to sign up for this movement of God in the world through Christ. One of the things I think you need to know, the 7 most important ones, is that Jesus made a lot of wine at a party one time. Isn't that something? We understand this. It's a big deal for a wedding to run out of something, or any important celebration or party, right? We know it's a problem to run out of drink. We have a word for it, a beer run, right? You send someone out to get the refills if you undershot it. It's pretty easy for us to imagine how a social gathering can go south if somebody didn't bring enough food or enough drink, right? But it's even probably worse for a first century Judean. There aren't corner stores. There aren't markets where they're open every day, right? There's markets, but it's probably certain times of the day, one big time of day as people bring their like wares to a central location in a city or town. You don't just run in the middle of the night and go pick up more stuff. It's not how these communities are planned. That's not how life moved in the first century, especially in impoverished areas. You also run into that issue of scarcity, right? Let's think about where these people have found themselves geopolitically. They are occupied by an empire that came in and said, oh, ancestral lands, you've passed these down for thousands of years, ours now. And you can work for us, you can be a tenant farmer on your own ancestral land, but all the best grapes, all the best olives, all the best fish, and all the best wheat first are going to go to Corinth, Thessalonica, Rome. We're going to ship them to where the important people are, and you can just work to make it happen. It's not easy to get more wine, even though those who are living here are probably working on farms and vineyards. They don't get to reap the first benefits of this hard work. And so the wine that they had provided at this party was probably hard won and a source of real pride. And so to run out would be embarrassment, possibly even shame for the hosts of this celebration. And there's no quick fix. And so we see Mary, the mother of Jesus, for some reason getting involved. We don't know. Maybe she's extremely close friends of the family, and so kind of in the inner circle, helping to plan things, helping to run things. Maybe she's not. Maybe she just, as a woman who experienced her own shunning and shaming around the birth of Jesus, having to live in a different town during her pregnancy, knows what it's like and does not want the matron of this family to feel that. Whatever it is, she's taking it upon herself to help the situation, and she comes to Jesus. It's a funny thing, you know. Have you ever heard sermons where, like my brother-in-law and I were talking about this, where like things are told in a very straightforward way in the Bible, but then you can kind of religify them and make them sound like bigger and more esoteric, right? So I heard a lot growing up, if a character in a story just physically walks up to Jesus, then it can be spiritualized, like, and that's why we come to Jesus when we're in need, right? Well, it's funny to take that in this way here, right? Because if we come to Jesus in our hour of need in this context, it's Jesus ran out of booze, right? Is that like what we're supposed to pray? But anyway, we find Mary coming to Jesus, and she says, we got to fix the situation. This family's in trouble, right? They undershot it. Maybe they couldn't afford it, whatever. And Jesus says, what does that have to do with me? Like, I just came to celebrate the wedding. I wasn't planning on doing anything yet. And he says, it's not my hour. Or it's not my appointed time If you follow the book of John, that's a theme over and over. John talks about Jesus' hour, Jesus' appointed time. And as the book begins to unfold, we see, as John begins to say it explicitly and then very explicitly at the end of the book, this hour is referring to the hour of his death. And, of course, by extension, the kinds of events that lead up to Jesus' death. For John, this is a central point of Jesus' ministry, and so to say it is not yet my hour is to say that Jesus hasn't yet begun that journey that's going to lead him to Jerusalem and lead him into confrontation with the leaders that will lead to his death. But Mary doesn't even respond to Jesus, which is interesting. She doesn't even say, well, I know it's not your hour, but can you just do it this one time? No argument, no discussion. She just turns to the servants and says, do what he says, he'll take care of it. So Jesus does. What a beautiful demonstration of their relationship. Jesus will say elsewhere, I've only done what my Father has willed. I've done nothing of my own accord, but only what my Father has told me to do. Well, in this case, we see Jesus thinking at first that his Father hasn't had this for him to do. He says, my hour's not yet come. What does this have to do with me? And yet he does it. So the point then, perhaps, as we see in this story, God speaks through the people around us. Jesus is right to later say, I've only done what my Father has willed for me, because he realizes that God is speaking through his mother at this time. Mary responded to the need of her community, and thus Jesus saw the leading of God in that act. It's interesting then that back-to-back stories use this phrase. Last week we heard the story of the baptism of Jesus, in which we see Jesus descend into the, well, maybe he didn't descend. That's the Baptist thing, right? Descend into the River Jordan. Maybe John sprinkled him. I don't know. The point is, he's in the River Jordan. He's baptized, and then the voice speaks and says, this is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Listen to what he says. And then the next story, we hear Mary say, listen to my son. Do what he says. Okay, John, we're reading this book. These stories are pretty stacked together. We get it. We're supposed to listen to Jesus. We're supposed to listen up. So what is it that we're supposed to do? What is it that this divine messenger is telling us? What's the next step? Well, for these people, it's very practical. Take the jars and fill them with water. Take the ceremonial jars of cleansing, and they will become wine. So is listening to Jesus just really practical instruction? Yes, most of the time. Because as we look at the things Jesus tells the communities in which he's teaching, he wants them to know what I'm telling you is just for the good of your community. Actions you take that bolster your strength and your connection. And in this context, we see Jesus telling us the tools that are utilized for religious ceremony are for the good of a community's celebration. They could have not listened to Jesus, these servants. It would have been very easy to not have listened to Jesus. The first thing Jesus tells them is to take ritualized jars. Jars is not the right word because it's too small. What was the word in the text? I don't know. These ritualized big containers of water. Buckets. Michael would say buckets. Michael says buckets for any container. So he's going to take these ritualized buckets and they're going to fill them with water, right? They could have said, but Jesus, here's the thing. Those are sacred. They're special. They're set apart for a particular purpose, right? They're not for doing whatever you're about to do. They're for washing our hands before we touch food so that we are not in violation of the law of Moses, right? We want our communities to be strong. We want God to favor our communities. And we have very clear instructions on how to do that. We wash before we eat. We wash in between different times of eating so that we are not ceremonially unclean. That's what these jars are for. We should use different ones. Jesus says, no, these are the right ones. These are the right jars. If we're going to listen to Jesus, if we're going to say yes to the divine voice and yes to the voice of Mary, that we should listen to him, then the messages are pretty clear. The proper use of religious tools of sacred objects, the proper use of rites and rituals and moral codes, is the well-being of the community. What did Jesus achieve in providing more wine at this celebration? Greater social cohesion as the party's allowed to continue. No shame for the hosts. He creates joy at the party. Remember, the one person says, man, usually people bring out the best wine first, and then when you can't really tell the difference anymore, you bring out the swill. But you say the best wine for last, which is fun, right? It's a source of pleasure and enjoyment. This is one of the best weddings we've been to. He creates a sense of, a reality of abundance in a community that is used to feeling like it's barely hanging on in the face of scarcity. Jesus provides the community with a workaround for the oppressive practices of Rome. If Rome takes all your best grapes and ships them off to people who are wealthier than you can ever imagine, how great is it that you can create wine even better? Right? There's a beautiful example of providing strength in a local context. As Jesus' ministry unfolds, we see he does this time and time again. Tangible, practical, and powerful moments of abundance and social cohesion when the threat of fear and lack hover over people. Opportunities to live and to flourish when instability is at their doorstep. Opportunities for love when hate is just so easy to have. John said that it was in this moment that Jesus revealed his glory. Incredible, right? We are drawn back to the time of Moses on Mount Sinai, where the glory of God was covered over with a veil. Moses had to wear a veil over his face so he wouldn't see the glory of the Lord, the brilliance, the luminosity, the weighty presence of God. The kind of thing that we hear from time immemorial, stories of people being overwhelmed when confronted with a reality that is deeper than any reality they've seen. The nature of being undone before the ineffable. John says Jesus revealed this when he made more wine. What a great way to talk about it. Paul had the same experience of the glory of Christ, right? Thrown to the ground, blinded, hears the voice and all of this. And from that moment on, then does his best to form the same kinds of communities that Jesus was forming. To make moments like this moment at Cana, communities where people can be free from shame, where people would find stability and strength and peace and cohesion through the use of religion. Not to divide or to oppress, but to bring together, to give tools to keep the celebration going in the face of despair. Seeds planted so that we could say the time for flowers has come again. I think it's hard for us to really grasp the importance of these kinds of communities in our lives because we are so naturally given over to the other stories around us. Stories that have instilled within us the inclinations to be opposed to one another in various ways, both individually, at small community levels, and at larger levels. It just seems to make more sense for us as humans to oppose each other, to work against each other, to be at odds from the desire to preserve one's own well-being. It's one of the earliest stories in the Bible, the dynamic of Cain and Abel. Faced with the threat of feeling like we're not accepted, faced with the shame of being told that what we've worked for maybe isn't right, we try to remove these feelings by removing the other. God warned Cain before he killed his brother and said, hey, I can tell something's wrong. You look sad. Sin is lying in wait for you. It's crouching around the corner. It's about to jump out and overtake you, but you can master it. If you choose, you can master it. That's a hopeful phrase, and so we ask ourselves, what can we do to master the sin of the inherent violence we seem to have in our hearts? What prevents us from falling into the trap of Cain or belittling others who for some reason make us feel threatened. What can we do to proactively then foster the kind of community we see God fostering in Jesus at the wedding of Cana? Well, our text in 1 Corinthians spells this out for us, and you heard it read. Paul says, God has already given the community everything it needs. You already have everything you need. That which we need to thrive has been gifted to us. It is grace. Everyone has been given gifts, and these gifts, Paul says, are the things about ourselves that make us ourselves and make us distinct from each other. These are the things we bring to the community. And Paul makes a very important point. Although each person is different and has various things they can bring that are all different from each other, each particular expression of God's Spirit is just that, a particular expression of the same Spirit. And why is that important? The Corinthian people have found themselves in a place where they argued about these gifts. Some thought they were better than others. A very natural, tangible thing, and we all know what it looks like and feels like. Hey, I'm the one who shares the knowledge. Yeah, but I'm the one that does these special musical prayers and other angelic tongues. Yeah, but I'm the one who demonstrates faith best. Yeah, but I'm the one who prepares the food at the love feast. Yeah, but I'm the one who gives the money for the food at the love feast. Right? And everyone is arguing about who's more important. And Paul's like, what are you talking about? Each gift from God is simply a gift from God. What a strange thing to argue about when there's only one Spirit, one Lord, and all of it is to make up one body. You can't say one part of the body is more important than another part of the body. Eldon will sometimes ask me these would you rather questions, right? Do your kids do this? And for Eldon, it's typically like, what kind of like devastating loss would you prefer over another devastating loss? So a couple weeks ago, we're driving in the car, and he's like, would you rather lose an arm or a leg? You know, one of these. And those are difficult questions. Why are those fun to think about? Because no one wants to lose an arm or a leg, right? Obviously. No one wakes up and says, you know, I got two eyes, so I don't need one of them. We know that's not how it works because everything in our body works together in a particular way that allows it all to kind of work together. And yet there are, of course, very different actions that we take with different parts of our body. We know this, right? There are parts of our body that need more defense against the elements, that are more prone to injury, right? In sports settings, we give them extra protection. We understand this. Paul actually makes the point, the weaker parts of the body are the ones we actually treat better. We cover them with an extra layer of clothing. We use protective gear, right? My hands do most of the work. As I thought through my day, I'm like, the hands do a lot. They help me when I speak. I do this. They give me luck when I knock on wood. No. But really, I can't drive without my hands. Some people can, but I can't. That's how I've learned to do it. I also pick most things up with my hands. No, let's be honest. I pick all things up with my hands. I don't use any other part of my body to pick things up. Right? My hands kind of lead the way in life. Opening doors, clearing things, sometimes using them as some kind of tool to hit something into place. That usually doesn't work and it hurts, right? They do a lot of the work, and yet I treat them the most poorly. I don't pamper my hands or thank them very often. In fact, my hands have it worse than most hands. My hands probably get together at night when I'm asleep and they say, not only does he mistreat us, not only do we do most of the work, but he bites us. He tears skin away with his teeth. And the teeth are probably like, sorry hands, right? I mistreat the thing that does the most work. There are other parts of my body that do way less work and are used way less often that get treated way better. And Paul's main point in this metaphor is that's the kind of community that we want to build, right? One that works together, one that's resilient, one that can withstand the attacks the world throws at us, one that brings joy and celebration, where people are free and happy and can celebrate, like at Cana. And then he says the religious components that we live, these are all part of the things that build that kind of community. The religious parts of our lives, we don't have clay pots for ceremonial washing, but we have our own sacred things and our own movements through religious life. Our particular community, we should be using these things to foster that celebration, that joy, and that depth, and that freedom. And that means we have to be intentional, that we do not favor some people over other people, and that we do not see that we ourselves are vying for extra favor. Right? Each one of us needs to be very, very careful, like very careful about thinking we deserve more or are more important in our community than somebody else. Paul makes it clear. The mentality of the community of Christ should be the mentality of Christ. Do not seek your own advantage, but that of the other. Very few of us do that. It's just not natural for us. But we have to do that if we're going to have the kinds of communities that bring us joy and depth and peace in life. In the context of a Christian community, I'm not talking about you're sitting with someone who's trying to say, my opinion is that we should harm other human beings, right? But in the context of a Christian community, if you think that your idea or your opinion is better than someone else's, then you're wrong. Isn't that interesting? I can just say that. Now, your idea might be better. Your idea might be more correct. But if you think it is, then you're wrong. Nobody is more important than anybody else. Everybody can bring their gift to the table. Does that create tension? Absolutely. Does that create strife? Absolutely. But do we have the way to manage it? Absolutely. Love and considering the other person first. Again, not someone saying I think we should harm other people or work against Christ or something like that. But if people are bringing the gifts of themselves to the table, then all come on equal footing. The only time we don't come together in straight equality is if someone actually needs extra care. Right? In all the works of Paul and all his letters, he never talks about, now remember, every once in a while you got to throw the stronger person a bone. He just doesn't say that. It just doesn't come up. The only time that he works against the idea of equality is when he says, if there's someone who needs extra care or extra support, you give that. If there's someone who's been disenfranchised or disadvantaged, you lift them up. There's never an acceptable time to position yourself over somebody else, or we will cease to be relevant as the body of Christ in the world. This is actually really good news. Right? The thing about the message of Jesus, the good news, the gospel, is that it confronts us at first, right? Like, yeah, well, I don't do that. That's not who I am. But then it gives us the opportunity to let go of those things that hold us back and to walk into life. To admit that the kind of community that Jesus and Paul imagine is one that clearly is more joyful, clearly more life-giving. If we have the courage, the strength to allow ourselves to open up. That's all it takes. We don't have to change much other than open ourselves to each other. That's, of course, vulnerable. And it leads to things vulnerability leads to. That's why we have the Bible to help us through it. But the point is we can foster a kind of place where our vulnerabilities don't leave us alone, stranded on an island in a desert, but can lead us into greater support of one another. So may you embrace today the good news. May you find your place in the body. It might be that you're a hand and you do a lot of the work, but you take a lot of the beating. That's someone's role. Maybe that you're the brain. You do a lot of the thinking, a lot of the ideas, and you spend a lot of energy doing it, most of which aren't really going to be implemented, and you feel like you're wasting your time. You might not be as visible as the other parts of the body. You might not be the forward-facing. You might not be the nose or the eyes, but your work is valuable. You might be the feet, carrying things outside the community, gathering others into the fold. And you may not be recognized as much because you're not here as often. You may be someone who's very quiet, caring, the kind of person that brings new life. The parts of the body that bring new life are the ones rarely seen by others, aren't they? And yet all the more essential. And so whatever our role is, whatever it is that we bring to the table, they're all all gifts of the Spirit. And so we must offer them for the good of ourselves, for the good of those we love, and for the good of those we hate, each holding each other in high esteem and high regard. May we find the grace to be this body. Let's pray. God, we ask that you rework within us life. We come with gratitude for the seed of life planted in us. We come with gratitude for the Spirit that lives within us. But we see that we spend a lot of our time trying to cover that over or ignore it or hamper its growth. And so we come again today with a spirit of repentance, with a willingness to be reshaped and changed again into the image of your Son. Give us the grace to be the kind of community that people can point to and say, that's where the party is. That's where I want to be. I know I'll be safe there. I know I'll be loved there. Give us the creativity and the imagination to take the steps we need to take to become that community. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, handed over to the authorities, he took bread and wine, and he broke it, and he blessed it, and he gave thanks for it, and he poured it out, and he blessed it, and he gave thanks for it. A meal that they'd probably gotten used to at this point. Yes, this was a special holy meal, but bread and wine were kind of part of the whole deal as you read the stories of Jesus. He is the bread of life, he tells his followers. If you eat this bread, if you move through this gathering, if you live in this kind of community, you're not going to hunger, you're going to have everything you need. The joy of wine, the joy of gathering together around one of humanity's most interesting inventions. We see Jesus do it time and time again with his disciples, to the point where some of the religious leaders become a bit uncomfortable. And yet here they are again, and this time there's less joy. There's a heavier atmosphere at their final supper together. When Jesus says, because the bread is broken, wine is poured out, it's a good metaphor for my body as I am about to be undone. And they're worried about it. Don't do it, Jesus. We'll protect you, blah, blah, blah. We know none of that was real. That was just coming from a place of fear for them. And Jesus knows this. And with compassion and grace, he says, no, I have to do this for you so that you will see the way of life promised so long ago, promised to Cain, promised to Abraham, promised to everybody. You can overcome sin. You can defeat it. Jesus says, I do this so that you can see sin is undone. It is defeated. It is destroyed. It cannot have power over you. Because if you give of yourself as I have given of myself, you will find that sin has no power in your communities. And so we take this each week in faithfulness to that, in remembrance of Christ, in the hope, the fierce faith that his life will be ours and that others will find joy and depth, meaning and healing. May grace fill your hearts as we partake today. Join me together in prayer. Community of faith, let us gather our courage in God's power.